Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to this webinar on the geopolitics of Ukraine war. Um, if you think this is the webinar on French cooking, you're in the wrong place. I think you can move on. My name is Ted Jackson. I'm the board secretary for the Group of 78. Most of you will know that we at the group work for peace, climate action, social justice, renewed multilateralism, and progressive Canadian foreign policy. And we think this is a really important moment in Canadian history and indeed for the world to really re-examine our thinking and our assumptions, particularly with respect to our neighbor to the south. We have a predatory US administration, one that is churning out chaos every day. We really need to understand that country and, as I say, re-examine what we think is going on in the world. And in particular, through the lens of a very important conflict, which we all have been concerned about, the Ukraine-Russian war. We are really fortunate, in fact, to have a wonderful resource person to walk us through this analysis today. And he's really one of Canada's premier political economy thinkers and someone that I've admired for many, many years, Manfred Bienefeld. So Manfred, let me introduce you briefly, but welcome.
Thank you. Good.
Manfred is a professor emeritus at Carleton University in the School of Public Administration, Public Policy and Administration. He holds a PhD in economics from the London School of Economics. He was previously at the prestigious Institute of Development Studies in the United Kingdom, and his research interests include development policy, financial deregulation, the debt crisis, and industrial policy. He's been a fierce and insightful critic of what he has called the dictatorship of finance in undermining the potential of globalization to reduce poverty in developing countries. In his retirement, he's, as you've seen in the note on his bio, he's currently lecturing and writing about the increasingly problematic evolution of the Bretton Woods institutions. And more widely recently on the seriously dysfunctional state of the international financial system as a whole. And he's taking on this issue in a serious way, in a big time way, and we are very glad to benefit from his research and his analysis. And I just want to say in a couple of personal notes, Manfred, when I first came to Carleton University myself, more than 30 years ago, you were working on green technology with the Canadian auto workers. So you were well ahead of your time on that front. And I also want to say, this is from my wife Magda and I, that your wife, Mary Lou, was one of our son Noah's best and favorite teachers in elementary school. He's doing very well, Mary Lou. He's a business owner, the attentive father of two beautiful girls. So thank you for getting him started. The agenda today is simple. Manfred will divide his remarks in two parts. After the first segment, I'll pose a few questions to Manfred. And after that, he'll proceed with the second part of his remarks. And then we'll go to the Q&A function of this application. And so please post your questions and comments in that Q&A section. We'll aim to wrap up around 2:30. And there'll be some links that Manfred will post for future reading if you want to pursue this subject. So without further ado, Manfred, welcome and thank you for doing this. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for a very wholesome introduction, Ted. It's a great pleasure for me to have this opportunity to raise questions that have been a great burden for me, and I'm sure for many of you in recent years. The world is clearly on a track that most of us are very uncomfortable with, and I would say rightly so. I would like to start by saying something which may be obvious. I'm not speaking for the group of 78. I'm a longtime member of the group, but I'm speaking as much to my fellow members as to others who have joined us for this session. And I do recognize that this is a very controversial topic and that people will, in some cases, be angered by some of the things I may have to say. I can only assure them that I'm not personally involved in these matters. I have tried very hard to abide by the principle that I repeated endlessly to my students throughout my teaching career. No argument is stronger than its ability to counter the strongest counter argument. And that means that if you find an argument that you don't agree with, I urge you not to reject it on the grounds that it's a so-called Putin talking point. Let me invite you to examine the evidence, and I'm glad to consider alternative evidence if I've ignored it. My main point in this first section is to focus specifically on the Ukraine conflict, and my purpose is to suggest that I believe that a careful evaluation of the evidence does not support the mainstream, constantly repeated claim that what we're dealing with in the Ukraine is an unprovoked, full-scale invasion of an authoritarian country into a democratic country. That is the brief summary. That is the basis for all of the enormous hostility, and that has triggered ultimately not just that heavy American involvement, which we have all come to understand, but has now, much to my absolute dismay, led Europe to announce that it is going to spend more than 800 billion euros in order to prepare for war with Russia. Now, I can tell you, I cannot imagine a situation that could be more upsetting to me. My first memories of my life were in a bomb shelter in Germany during the bombing when the Third Reich, for good reason, came to its fiery end. And to see Germany now preparing for war against Russia under circumstances where, in my view, there are no grounds for this whatsoever is really, really disturbing and depressing. So let me try and explain to you why I think the world has found itself in a place that most people, if they looked at the facts, at least at the way I see them, would never accept. The available evidence clearly suggests that this is not a war primarily a war between Ukraine and Russia. It's a war between the US and Russia. And in the second part of my remarks, I will give all the details of the larger program by which the US chose in the late 90s to adopt a foreign policy that would be utterly interventionist and seek what they like to call full spectrum dominance in all theaters. In this case, what happened was the standard modus operandi of the color revolutions. Most of us are now familiar with those. You find dissident, often very extreme opponents. In Ukraine, it was the right sector. You get them to hijack peaceful demonstrations about some legitimate topic. They soon start attacking the authorities. They come with weapons to those demonstrations. As soon as the authorities respond in any way, then of course the attention is all focused on that response. And in the Ukrainian case, it so happened that this process was taken to its pinnacle when I had always understood 70, but recently people have been using the number 100 people were killed by snipers in Maidan Square. And the unbelievable irony is that there is a huge monument to these martyrs in Maidan Square when the available evidence carefully examined shows clearly that these people were shot by the right sector extremists, not by the authorities. The American government was clearly instrumental in establishing the new government. We have the famous telephone conversation between Victoria Nuland and the American ambassador, in which they discuss who should be chosen as for which position. And famously, at one point, when the ambassador says, well, maybe the Europeans wouldn't be very comfortable with the particular choice, Ms. Nuland's timeless response is, fuck the Europeans. And that same contempt was evident when during the demonstrations, because as I said, this is the modus operandi, we're very familiar with this now. But in this particular case, it was much more open than usual. McCain and Lindsey Graham, senators came and spoke at demonstrations. And Victoria Nuland even passed out cookies at the demonstrations, showing the same contempt for international law that she showed when she made that remark I just quoted. So that's what happened. That's what happened in 2014. A government was established which was anything but democratic, and which immediately proceeded to pass really draconian measures against the large Russian-speaking minority, some would even say majority, of Ukrainians who primarily speak Russian. The Russian was removed as an official language, which of course was disastrous in those areas of the country where there were many people who spoke only Russian and who only transacted business in Russian. But the Russian Orthodox Church was suppressed. Russian culture was denigrated and removed from school curricula and from many public spheres. And when in the eastern provinces, which are largely the oblasts, which are largely Russian-speaking, when there was opposition to this, that opposition was confronted with violence almost directly. Some very famous instances for which people can find videos on YouTube at any time. Now, Russia's response to these developments at first was rather moderate, with the exception of the Crimea. And Crimea is the largest maritime Russian base. It's their only access to sweet water. It is absolutely historic, and there was no question that that would be an issue, and Russia instantly organized a referendum, which was observed by many international observers. Now, there's a big debate. Some people argue it was very distorted. There are very legitimate international observers who have reported that in their view it was straightforward. But I think, honestly, no serious person could suggest that the population of Crimea would not vote tomorrow in a referendum to join Russia, given what happened to the Ukrainian government in Kyiv. For the rest of the time, in the early period, the Russian response to the opposition in the Eastern Oblast was rather modest. They did not support calls for separatism, and they sought to find diplomatic solution, and they initiated the talks that led to the Minsk Accords, Minsk I and Minsk II. And they had France and Germany participate in those discussions as guarantors. And those agreements reached diplomatic solutions, reasonable diplomatic solutions, which involve uh, uh, constitutional changes that would allow somewhat greater autonomy to different oblasts, that would allow those Russian-speaking oblasts to maintain a Russian culture, a Russian church, Russian language. But it turned out that the government, which was had numerous very strong representatives of the right sector in the cabinet, had no intention of implementing these accords. And indeed, Mrs. Merkel, amazingly enough, a couple of years later publicly revealed or admitted that they never had any intention of pressing the Ukrainian government to live up to these accords, that they were simply buying time to build up the Ukrainian military. And you might ask, then build up for what? Well, I think the obvious answer is build up for war. During the time between 2014 and 2022, when Russian troops entered Ukraine, the Ukrainian military, now these numbers are not exact, but orders of magnitude, the Ukrainian military was built up from 300,000 to 1,300,000. So this was a major undertaking, and the arms that were provided were of the latest variety in many cases. What is not so surprising is that this particular Ukrainian government didn't enforce these accords. What is more surprising, indeed to me breathtaking, is that the Europeans, who are so concerned, so actively concerned about the fact that there are some racist right-wing elements in their populist movements, that those same Europeans should have had no concern dealing with these right sector extremists in the Ukrainian setting. It's, to me, continues to be an incredible mystery. And given all of that Europe now, even given Trump's sudden raising of issues, and I'll come to that later, Europe has doubled down, tripled down on the basic position that, as I said earlier, they are going to war with Russia. The fact of this enormous discrepancy between the EU's concern about human rights and these fascist possibilities and their almost total lack of concern about these questions in the Ukraine. Part of the reason why that dichotomy isn't so obvious is because the Western press has simply made it disappear from view, just as they did with the extremists that now rule Syria. Those fascist groups were given new uniforms and a new name, and nobody talks about that anymore. And if anybody talks about it, then it's called a Putin talking point. But if you go back and look at the newspapers at the time of the coup, the Western newspapers were actively talking about those fascist groups. And the problem is that not only were those Minsk Accords not implemented, but the harassment, indeed the attacks on the Eastern Oblasts continued. The OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, was tasked with monitoring the Minsk Accords, and they have monitored this part of the story in great detail. And their estimate is that 14,000 people were killed in the bombardments, largely heavily from the Ukrainian side into those Eastern Oblasts. And that in the last 2 weeks before the Russian troops moved in, those attacks increased dramatically. And they even, if you go to YouTube, you can find OIC maps showing exactly where the shells landed in those 2 weeks. The whole idea that this is a conflict between democracy and authoritarianism has no real substance whatsoever. First of all, Russia is a democratic country. Russia has an opposition media, has very strong opposition TV channels. There are the democracy, the parties maneuver and try to manage the democracy, but that's true in all democracies. And people have for years been talking about whether US democracy at this stage is really worthy of the name. But in the Ukraine, on the other hand, in that first phase, there was no democracy whatsoever. That was a government installed by coup d'etat. And then we come to the 2019 elections. And we have this extraordinary sequence of events where Zelensky runs on a platform which heavily focuses on making peace with Russia. On the basis of that platform, he gets 73% of the votes, which is a massive majority by any standards. And then comes under dramatic, heavy pressure from the right sector, with some leaders of the right sector openly and publicly announcing that if he dares to implement the policies that he ran on, in one example, he would be hung from a tree and his government wouldn't last very long. And some of the people who spoke in those terms ended up in the cabinet of that government. And of course, the platform was never implemented to any degree. Nor is it true that there ever was a point before 2014 where the Ukrainian population had shown democratic preferences for either NATO membership or for abandoning neutrality. So the idea that the search for NATO membership and the abandonment of neutrality was some democratically driven project has no foundation. The last poll that I could find before 2014 gave 13% support for the idea that NATO would be the best way to secure Ukraine's security, NATO membership. So by the time we come to 2022, the situation in Ukraine is clearly deteriorating, and Russia makes a final desperate attempt to find a diplomatic solution. And they issue a proposal, a very well worked out proposal, seeking discussion about a security structure for Europe, mutually agreeable security structure for Europe, a security structure that would make it clear that in a post-Soviet world, there was in fact no need for NATO. NATO was established in order to protect Europe from what was deemed an imminent threat from the Soviet Union. After the Soviet Union fell, Russia was not a threat to Europe. Russia tried to build links with Europe. At one point, they even offered or asked to join NATO, which would have made the point most clearly. So now in 2021, when things are coming to a head and they very much want to find a resolution, a diplomatic resolution, they present this proposal and they're essentially given the finger. It's rebuffed in the most arrogant and ridiculous way imaginable. And Tony Blinken announces to the world that Ukraine is an independent country and they can join whatever security alliance they like. This from a country that almost launched the nuclear weapons directly when they discovered missiles in Cuba. But this is not maybe so surprising. What's much more surprising is that the Western media, and that includes all of our countries, treated this as a reasonable response. So then Russian troops move into Ukraine under these very fraught circumstances. First of all, the number of troops are vastly smaller than could ever be described as a full-scale invasion intended to take over the country, which was never the intent. Uh, and within 2 months of that, the Russians have initialed an agreement with Zelensky's government. And in that agreement, they agreed to withdraw all Russian troops, to restore all of Ukraine's borders, apart from Crimea, on only two conditions, essentially. The Minsk Accords be implemented, and, well, the Minsk Accords included Ukraine not being part of NATO. So that's absolutely incontrovertible evidence that the Russians did not invade with larger imperial ambitions, that other countries would be next to be invaded, that the rest, all of this is simply made up. And then finally, the fact that the US and the UK then intervened at that moment to scupper that Istanbul Agreement, in my view, I would put to you, makes those countries responsible for the war. In other words, as always, there are many different things coming together to produce a result. But here you had a situation which was absolutely clear-cut. If that agreement was signed, there would not have been a war. And if the agreement was not signed, there would be a war. And the UK and the US chose, and the reasons for that I will talk about in the second part of my presentation. The US and the UK chose the war. And for that reason, they are responsible for all the death and destruction that that war has brought. And that is a source of enormous, that is an enormous tragedy, which will make future relationships much more difficult. That's the first part of what I wanted to say.
Okay. Thank you very much, Manfred. These are important things for us to consider. It looks like Jeffrey Sachs also has agreed that it was really with the fall of the Berlin Wall that the Americans set out on this, what could be called unipolar defense strategy or war strategy, and expansion of NATO. So that's one historical perspective, which you're bringing as well. But there's a longer historical perspective where over the longer history of Ukraine and Poland, I would say, that there has been a perceived and actual threat by Russia to the legitimacy and the borders of those two states over a long period of time. In your thinking, how do you see that longer arc of history? Is it affecting this situation? Did it make it easier in a way, perhaps, for the Americans to play their cards?
Well, Ted, you're absolutely right, of course. The modus operandi that I spoke about, which is now so well established, almost always zeroes in on historic grievances, either ethnic divisions or grievances involving previous wars. And I can't gainsay those feelings, they exist. The question is how we deal with them, whether we stoke them or whether we work towards eliminating them. And I would simply ask people to judge governments because the country has the same name. Well, in this case, it didn't even have the same name. It reverts to the name Russia. It doesn't mean that it's the same thing that Russia that we read about in the history books. It's a new country. It's different people. It's different circumstances. And I would venture to say that the Russia that emerged out of the ashes of the Soviet Union gave no indication, no serious indication that they had any hostile intent vis-a-vis Western Europe. Indeed, well, I mean, the early stage, the Yeltsin stage, of course, was almost a joke. They were selling off Russia to our oligarchs in those days. And a lot of those oligarchs still live in Britain and are billionaires to this day. But when Putin came to power, he did stop the looting of Russia. He did clamp down on some of the oligarchs. He did make it clear that the oligarchs that remained would have to function within the framework of national policies that were concerned with Russia's national circumstances. And he rescued Russia from a situation that was really, really dire. And most people don't realize. I mean, after the fall of the Soviet Union, per capita GDP in Russia fell by more than 50%.
Mm.
We can't even imagine it. When our GDP per capita falls by 2%, we talk about crisis. The newspapers will be full of black ink about crisis. Russia's life expectancy fell dramatically. Alcoholism increased dramatically. It was a rupture that was incredibly destructive in human and social terms. And there's no question that Putin has stabilized that situation and has rebuilt a viable society, I would say, and a society that supports him. And there's no question of that.
By the way, I remember my own consulting work in Eastern Europe, going into the Baltic states and hearing that the Americans had just been there, telling those countries they didn't need government anymore; they just needed capitalism. So it was a otherworldly experience even at that time.
Well,
Um,
we once had somebody come to the school and invited by one of my colleagues who believed in markets to the full. And this man was a consultant to the IMF, and he made the bold statement that the world needed to move towards a world without government. And
yeah.
I just couldn't contain myself, and I put up my hand and I said, "Oh, but we already know what that looks like. It's called Haiti."
Yeah. Well, and we're getting a taste of it south of the border,
Yeah,
uh,
well,
even
very
today.
good, yes.
Yeah. Let's go back to the 2019 election, which you mentioned, and Zelensky winning 73% of the vote on a peacemaking campaign. It sounded like her.
Mhm.
Um, at that time, what you talked about, you don't have any data on EU, the orientation of the citizenry to join the EU in that moment, or maybe you do, I don't know. But
Okay.
my understanding is that, in addition, there were some very active peace movements, civil society movements in Ukraine. And my question is, I believe that those were independent and locally driven. I don't know this field so well, but that was my reading. If that's the case, what happened to those movements? Do they still exist in Ukraine society? Are there parallel movements in Russian society that either among citizens or among veterans of the war who might play a role in ending this conflict?
Well, the peace movement certainly existed, and I think they were influential. Now, the foreign involvement in the NGO community was very heavy, and I couldn't be specific about how far it went. I know that when USAID was recently virtually dissolved, one
Yeah.
of the things that came into the news was that I think it was 18 of the 20 independent newspapers and news agencies in Ukraine were US funded. And so there was a big crisis there. And it's certainly true that around the time of the 2014 events, two new television stations were started out of nowhere, and they were uh, uh, passing out propaganda very intensively. So those there were movements, and certainly support for peace was very strong. support for the EU, and I'm glad you mentioned that, support for the EU was strong. And that was actually one of the driving forces of those peaceful demonstrations that were
Hmm.
that there were people who wanted that process to go a bit quicker.
Yeah.
And it's worth noting that the Istanbul Agreement that was initial and was then scuppered by the US and the UK allowed for EU membership. It simply said
Hmm.
not NATO membership, but EU membership was so Russia had no objection to EU membership. And I'm
Okay.
absolutely certain my experience with a wide range of officials and academics and people in Russia at various points, EU membership was something that they would have thought of in very positive terms. It was the world they thought they were moving into when they moved out of the Soviet things, which
Yeah.
is why the whole thing is so ironic to me.
Hmm.
After all, people recognize that after 9/11, Russia was very helpful to the United States, and was treated as an ally. And it was around, as I'll come on to talking about that in the next half, how that changed and why that changed.
Yeah.
Now, of course, once the war started,
Hmm.
then, as happens anywhere, peace movements are not seen uh, very favorably on either side of the border. Uh, but that was
Yeah.
true in our own countries. Wartime is different.
Hmm. Okay. Well, that's an important distinction around the EU and NATO membership, respectively.
Yeah, yes, I think so.
Um, I have a couple of questions from the chat, or at least from the Q&A, which
Mhm.
I think I'll raise now. They sort of anticipate your next section, but I think it's worth getting them out on the table now, and you might just think about them, or maybe you're going to speak about them
Mhm.
in part two. But one is around a question around: is there a link between the apparent exhaustion of Germany's and Europe's growth model and the decision to rearm in confrontation with Russia? So that's more of an economic slash military tactic
Well,
question.
okay.
Um, and the second one it relates, and again, you may be talking about this soon, but in your view, can the Trump administration's current posture towards Russia primarily be explained by the U.S. intention to confront China? And what risks do you think this entails for Europe? If you want to kick those into the next section, we can, but I thought I'd raise them since they're up now.
Well, let me just speak quickly to them. The first question, Europe has created a massive problem for itself. And this is one of the biggest issues now. I wanted to end the first part by saying, by allocating, in my view, responsibility for the fact that there was a war. Now, what happens once a war begins, as every war correspondent historian will tell you, wars have a life of their own, and things happen that very quickly create circumstances that become irreversible. And some of the poison that this war has spread and will spread for probably generations to come can't be just eliminated. The economic damage done to Europe is massive. The destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline has made a huge difference to the European economic situation. Uh, the disappearance of the Russian market, the redirection of the Russian economy to the east, have all been extremely costly for Europe. And Europe then found itself in a place, particularly when Trump suddenly came along with his uh, crazy tariffs. Europe found itself in a very, very difficult place. But they were also totally committed to this idea that this war had to be justified. I mean, some estimates say that a million people, a million soldiers have died in the Ukraine. Nobody can lightly take responsibility for that. So now, they have found themselves in a position where they have to double down on the idea that they must win a victory and they cannot admit defeat. And so they have moved to this incredible decision to spend $800 billion to literally, I'm saying these words, these are their words, to prepare for war with Russia. Have these people even thought about what that means for people? I mean, I'm going to come in my second section. We once had a mad doctrine that said mutually assured destruction in a nuclear world. You cannot attack a nuclear power directly because the result will be mutually assured destruction. Well, that principle has already been abrogated in the current Ukraine war, but now Europe has announced that it's going to build a massive army. It is absurd, honestly, beyond words, and I cannot believe that the European population can just sit by and think, oh well. So that part of it, I think, yeah, it will revive the economy to some degree, but the ultimate irony is that at least for the first period, a lot of that 800 billion will be spent on U.S. armaments, which is an even greater irony when you put it in context now. Now, sorry.
What about China?
China, yeah, definitely. We have, I at one point, I have to admit, and I don't admit this lightly, I actually began to think that if I were American, I might even consider voting for Trump, because on foreign policy, he seemed to be taking a different view and opening the door to a different world. But since he's come to power, I mean, Rubio has said publicly that we now live in a multipolar world and no longer in the so that.
Mm-hmm.
And Trump has said publicly that he would like nuclear arms control talks between U.S., Russia, and China. Now, that is, to put it mildly, extremely positive. Mm-hmm. But I would say, apart from that, every single thing he's done has been simply to double down on the old, absolutely constant militarism that has been the main feature of U.S. foreign policy ever since Clinton and definitely since George W. Bush. And Hegseth just recently, yesterday, made a very strong announcement in which he said that all this critique of Trump was silly. He was not soft on these things. They're building up arms and they're modernizing their arms and they're spending heavily on arms in order to confront China. So it's out there. I mean,
it's out there.
And,
yeah.
And for Israel, of course, we have these unbelievable Zionists in charge. I mean, there is Tulsi Gabbard, but some of it I think is political flim-flam. I took it seriously very briefly, but at this point, I don't see any evidence. And in a way, Trump could even argue he's been very successful because, after all, he just wanted Europe to increase its military spending to 2% of GDP. Well, now he's maneuvered them in a situation where they're going to expand it to, 5% of GDP? Almost unthinkable numbers.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, before we go to your second part, there is a comment here, which I think people may want you to think about or comment on. It's not easy, and it's basically the question: would Navalny agree that Russia was a functioning democracy?
Navalny was an absolutely marginal figure in Russia. He never had, when he ran for election, he got fractional support. It was again, this is part of the modus operandi. You pick figures, you build them up, and you create myths around them. I'm not going to go into detail, and that's not really the point. This point isn't about, what score would I give Russia on a scale from 1 to 10 on the democracy? What I've said is it's a democratic country. The democracy is not perfect. And as I've said, the discussions about democracy in America, there are many very thoughtful people who for years have said this is no longer a true democracy. So those games we can play endlessly. The idea that Navalny and his experience give grounds for us declaring war on Russia is an absurd idea. That's all I would say on that.
Okay, thanks. All right, let's get to part two. Over to you.
Okay, so part two is to say, okay, that was what happened in Ukraine. So how do we understand that? Well, obviously, we have to understand it by looking at the bigger picture. And when we look at the bigger picture, what we find is that starting in basically the mid-70s, the architecture that was established after the Second World War, the Bretton Woods architecture, undergoes a dramatic change. And I have long argued and written that Bretton Woods remained in name, but was basically turned 180 degrees. In the initial incarnation, it existed with a very strong Keynesian element, and that Keynesian element didn't pertain to deficit spending and the stuff that's usually associated with Keynes. The Keynesian element revolved around what Keynes once called the keystone of the arch of his thinking, and that had to do with capital controls. And I maybe just want to really emphasize that point. In a world of totally free capital flows, capital seeks an equilibrium, a global equilibrium. And that equilibrium involves all kinds of variables, including the relationship between labor and capital, the relationship between capital and government, the relationship between the search for efficiency and the search for communal harmony, and many other social objectives. And if it's international capital that rules, well, it will have by definition, it will have no concern with the particularities of given societies. Keynes's phrase was that unless the rate of profit is nationally determined, no society can pursue its own favorite social experiments. And the first part of Bretton Woods allowed for sovereignty, allowed for countries to operate their economies to full employment, at full employment. And the result was, by far, the most successful period the capitalist economy has ever experienced. Growth rates were faster, both in terms of output and productivity, but by far the most important and the most spectacular difference was that the benefits of that growth were very widely distributed. In fact, in the period from 1948 to 1973, real household income in the United States for the poorest 20% of households increased more than for the richest 20% of households. And the others lay in between those two, the richest, the least, the poorest, the most. And since the mid-70s, since we switched to what is rightly called the neoliberal model, when all those constraints were eliminated, when all those defense mechanisms that had been built into the original Bretton Woods systems were eliminated, all of the things that Keynes had feared and predicted happened. Income inequality grew explosively. Instability, financial instability grew explosively. Investment levels as a proportion of GDP fell. Growth rates fell, and growth was much, much more unequally distributed. And that continues to this day. Now, when in 1991, the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War came to an end, there was a lot of talk about we were moving into a multipolar world, and there was going to be a big peace dividend. I mean, all those resources we were spending on armaments, we could now spend on schools and education. And I wrote an article in 1994 in which I said that I was very sad to have to advise people that this was a total misconception. We were not moving from a bipolar world to a multipolar world. We were moving from a bipolar world to a unipolar world. And it was going to be a very, very dangerous unipolar world, because that unipolar power was absolutely intent on implementing an economic model, namely the neoliberal model that empowered market actors. And that model itself is divisive, ultimately unstable, and unsustainable. And as that reality became clear, the unipolar power would probably be pushed to trying to implement that program by military means, by increasingly military means. So far from us looking forward to a peace dividend, we needed to look forward to a world that would look very different. Now, around about that time, around the mid-90s, when I wrote that paper, there was also a lot of optimism. There was Fukuyama published his book called The End of History, where he basically said, listen, now that the Cold War is over, we can see that liberal democratic capitalism is going to be it from now on, for the foreseeable future, at least. It's just going to remain relatively stable. And the World Bank issued a famous report. I can't go into all the details. It had lots of dimensions. But in that report, they basically announced that the relatively interventionist policies which some East Asian economies had used to achieve phenomenal success, just as China has used to achieve its phenomenal success, those kinds of interventionist policies would, the World Bank announced, no longer be available to other developing countries should they think they might want to use them. They wouldn't be available because all the new international rules and regulations that had been established in the meantime, to a very large degree with the help of the World Bank, had now been declared illegal. And any country that tried to use such policies would immediately be confronted with the retaliation, which would negate any value they might derive from those policies, which I found a like incredible chutzpah on the part of the bank. And then there was a famous article in Foreign Affairs, 1994, again, which basically argued by a very well-connected member of the foreign policy community in the States, in which he argued that there was occasional noise about China pursuing an industrial policy, sort of along the lines of Japan and South Korea. But the writer was sure that nobody needed to pay any attention to that. He said, China's much too corrupt and incompetent and inefficient to ever make such a policy successful. And anyway, he said, and this is the part I want to emphasize right now, anyway, he said, China is now so locked into these international rules that it could never make those policies work. Well, there were some other people who turned out to agree with me. They were the neocons in the United States, many of whom ended up in government in the George W. Bush government. Some of them were very well-known names, Dick Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfenson. And they established a project for a new American century in 1997. And as a slight joke, I'm going to say I'm sure it wasn't because they read my 1994 paper, but what they said in the project was that, the world was a complicated place. And there was America was just too hesitant about projecting its power and implementing the policies that it knew to be the progressive policies that were needed. And so they said that America needed a much more muscular foreign policy, which was prepared to promote those policies, even if there was opposition. A few years later, after the policies had already come into action very actively, Robert Kagan, who was one of the founding members of this group, wrote an article in Foreign Affairs again, in which he gloated about the fact that this policy was now US policy and was, in his view, obviously eminently successful. And he summarized the policy as follows. I thought it might be useful just to read his summary. This new muscular foreign policy consisted of, quote, a belief in the rectitude of applying US moralism to the world stage, support for the US to act alone, the promotion of American-style liberty and democracy in other countries, the belief in American hegemony, the confidence in US military power, and a distrust of international institutions. Another member of this group even wrote at one point that he wrote that before the Iraq War, that after the Iraq War, there would be people still wailing absurdly about the United Nations, when in fact the United Nations would have ceased to have any role to play in the world. This was the foreign policy that America adopted in the early part of the 20th century. And the world pretended as if nothing had happened. And all these wars happened. Well, there was the other really, really significant morsel in that first statement of the Project for a New American Century, which said, unfortunately, the American population probably wouldn't support such a muscular foreign policy unless there were to be an event of the scale of Pearl Harbor. And then 9/11 happened. And this is very deep water. All I will say is there were a lot of things about 9/11 that remain open, to put it mildly, and unexplained. And there's a book, people who are interested, Dennis Fritz has just published a book, Deadly Betrayal, a very, very powerful book. He was somebody absolutely involved at the very center of the events following 9/11. And in an interview with Chris Hedges, and you can find it on YouTube, just type in Dennis Fritz, Chris Hedges, he responds to a question from Chris, and he says, yes, I do have to admit that there were people in the Bush government who were, quotation marks, delighted by the events of 9/11. Anyway, after 9/11, we come to the War on Terror, and I would suggest that it should really be known as the War of Terror, because what happened, and Wesley Clark, the former commander of NATO forces in Yugoslavia, has written in his book that he came across somebody in the Pentagon who had just received a message from the George W. Bush cabinet saying that they were to invade Iraq, and indeed they were going to overturn 7 governments in the next 5 years. And 6 of those have now been overturned, and Iran is the one that is in the crosshairs now. the last on the list. So this is not somebody making this up. This is the reality. This is what people said. This is what they did. The wars happened. The countries were destroyed. Every one of those wars were human and social and political disasters on a scale that you really can't exaggerate. Libya was the most successful country in Africa. Standards of living were higher than in any other, possibly with the exception of South Africa. Even the foreign companies operating in Libya were very surprised when Libya was suddenly targeted and torn to shreds. Iraq, what do we need to say? Iraq is hell on earth. Syria today. We're doing the same thing in Syria that we did with the right sector in the Ukraine. We gave them a new suit and a new haircut and a bit of PR, and now we treat them as if they are a normal government. And this was the world in which Ukraine came into the crosshairs, and the NATO expansion became a really central part of the story. NATO expansion and the name just slips my mind stupidly. One of the most famous American diplomats, I'll think of it in a moment, wrote at the time, the architect of the containment doctrine, George Kennan, wrote when people started talking about the expansion of NATO, that this would be the gravest possible mistake. It would be a mistake that would condemn the world to another Cold War and to conflicts that were absolutely avoidable. And that this would ultimately push the Russians into an adversarial stance when there was absolutely no need. The ambassador to Moscow at the time, Burns, who is now the head of the CIA, wrote a famous message saying that expanding NATO, particularly expanding it to the Ukraine, would cross the reddest of red lines and would undoubtedly create the basis for conflict. But this was the route that America chose to take. And again, it's really open. It's not something that odd people sitting in basements on their computers are inventing. The Rand Corporation in 2019 issued a document. I have it on my computer. The document is called Extending Russia. It's a document commissioned by the Army, by the US Army. And it's a document asking them to give ideas of all the different ways in which the US could undermine and destabilize the Russian government. And there was one passage which I thought it was worth just picking out. Most of these measures, and they talk about subverting it, using NGOs, trade sanctions, all the stuff that we see going on is listed and discussed. Most of these measures, whether in Europe or the Middle East, so by the way, these measures are applied everywhere, not just in a few marginal developing countries. And I'll come to that in a minute. Most of these measures risk Russian reaction that could impose large military costs on US allies and the US himself. Increasing military advice and arms supplies to the Ukraine is the most feasible of these options, with the largest impact. But any such initiative would have to be calibrated very carefully to avoid a widely expanded conflict, to which I only added the word oops. So we live in a world where the militaristic stance of the United States has totally come to dominate the globe. There's a book recently published that documents in great detail 42 government coups engineered by the US. And that's apart from the wars. And yet, there's a very powerful part of mainstream media in the West that insists on discussing the world as if the biggest problem in the world were Russia and China, and that the US and the West were somehow here to try to contain the evil machinations of those countries. The reality is the exact opposite. And maybe I'll just end with this because we're going to run out of time, or at least I'd like to leave time for questions. Canada had better take note of these developments because, as the tariff initiatives have made clear, nobody is immune. We're also a target. Yugoslavia was once a very successful country, and Yugoslavia was cynically and systematically dismembered. And they were dismembered in a variety of ways. They operate simultaneously. So in the Yugoslav case, they made the mistake of accepting too much finance in the structural adjustment context. So they found themselves suddenly in very deeply indebted. And then US interest rates rose sharply. And like so much of the developing world, they were suddenly caught in a trap. And when the Yugoslav president went to the United States to talk to George Bush Sr. and to plead for debt relief, he was told there was no such possibility. But, and people are interested, there's an incredible film made by a Canadian of Yugoslav heritage called The Weight of Chains. Weight, W-E-I-G-H-T, The Weight of Chains. There's a volume 1 and a volume 2, which documents the dismemberment of Yugoslavia in harrowing detail. And what he shows, and he actually cites the document, at the same moment when Bush told the Yugoslav president no debt relief was possible, they had made a decision that those parts of Yugoslavia that were prepared to take a separatist stance would have access to finance. So it's a double-barreled strategy. And of course, in addition, even I'm sure there were misinformation and disinformation campaigns and NGOs inserted into Yugoslavia. Without question, that was happening as well. But there was the crisis that put the government in a bind, and then there was the calibrated help that encouraged the separatist forces that then exploded and which were immediately recognized when Croatia declared unilateral independence after starting the harassment and expulsion of the Serbs who lived in the Croatian area. They were immediately recognized. I think Germany was the first country to recognize instantly. So when Canada suddenly faces these tariffs, which could potentially have very negative consequences, and if in the midst of dealing with those really negative consequences, all of a sudden there were very positive initiatives to some of our resource-based provinces that might have a lot to gain by moving towards the States. And then there would be a lot of NGOs and help from inside. As I said, Yugoslavia was once a very successful country, and nobody would have dreamed that it would have fallen apart. In fact, Yugoslavia was a beacon to the world. Tito's funeral was the largest funeral, at least by some accounts. 62 heads of state attended Tito's funeral because he was respected so highly around the world. My last word is we need to understand this is happening. This is happening not just in the Ukraine, it's happening in the Middle East. We are standing tall behind the ever more incredible genocide in Gaza. And we are stirring the same pot in Taiwan. We are encouraging the separatist forces. And even in the last few weeks, there are reports that the government, with strong American support and lots of new arms being shipped into Taiwan, may be getting close to declaring unilateral independence. And if they were to declare unilateral independence, there would be war. Mm-hmm. The idea that China was going to invade Taiwan, that was never going to happen unless there was a declaration of independence. It was the same with Hong Kong. When Hong Kong was treated as a colony by the Brits, and democracy was never even considered. And then it became part of China, and the terms on which it became part of China was called two systems, one nation. And the two systems ran in parallel very successfully for a rather long time. And then there was the yellow umbrella color revolution and started pushing for independence. And that was the bottom line. And this is the same thing if outside forces were to come into the US or any other country and start financing independence movements. There would be a response because states are interwoven at a very deep level, so that independence is always an enormously painful thing. So the problem now is that Canada is trapped. I spent a lot of my career writing and invoking against the free trade agreements. Why? Because the free trade agreements locked us into a very tight relationship on the North American continent. They weren't actually mostly about trade. They were mostly about restricting the ability of Canada to pursue those diversification policies which now everybody says we really need, because we have to diversify our economy. But what those agreements did is they restricted, they limited, and that's always their main intent, the ability of governments to pursue more independent economic policies. And now, of course, the fact that there were people who said those things doesn't make any difference. It's irrelevant. But we are now trapped. We are very vulnerable. And we need to be clear that those risks are real for us as they were for other countries. The trouble is that for us to take any kind of strongly independent stance at this moment would probably mean that we would get even heavier tariff burdens imposed on us. So, like a lot of the Europeans, you're caught between a rock and a hard place. But that's how I see our current situation and the global situation. The global situation is poised on a knife edge. And then maybe my final point is this. Trump is unbelievable. I mean, he is so erratic and so superficial and so absolutely uncentered and unprincipled in so many ways. But there's a great danger of falling into the trap of thinking, oh, but the US before Trump was fine, was good. No, the Biden administration took us as close to nuclear war as we have ever been. And I'll just illustrate the point. When the ATACMS missiles were first allowed to be shot deep into Russia. So here now we're starting to attack Russia directly. The MAD doctrine has been set aside. There are people who say, oh, the Russians are just bluffing. They won't do anything. The Russians have already been surrounded by missiles. Their warning times are very, very short. And the whole point about the nuclear standoff is the warning times become critical. So all of a sudden, we have a situation where these missiles, and the first time the ATACMS missiles are launched, they just partially destroy an early warning radar station. Precisely a radar station designed to give that little warning that you would have if a nuclear attack actually occurred. And this not so long after an American admiral who was a member of STRATCOM, that's the outfit that actually governs the nuclear strike force. Not long after that, Admiral had said publicly that the US was ready and prepared to fight and win the limited nuclear exchange. And then missiles are shot at the early warning stations. And my contention is, and my belief is, if that had happened the other way around, the missiles would have been launched already. Because you only have, the Russians particularly, have a very short warning time. And we can all just thank the good Lord that they were restrained enough not to respond. And we are still in a world where those risks are very, very real. And Canada needs to redouble its efforts to restore the United Nations. Lavrov actually gave a marvelous speech to the Security Council within the last year. If we lived in a sane world, that speech would be held up as literally a beacon. And it was a speech reaffirming passionately the basic values of the United Nations: respect for sovereignty, respect for borders. And some people will be going crazy saying, yeah, but Russia, I've explained why. If transgressing a border is such a heinous crime, as some people seem to think it is, well, then it must be equally heinous when the US does it. And they've done it many, many times. But Lavrov's speech reasserted the principles of the United Nations and basically made people confront the fact that the United Nations today cannot function in the way it was intended because there is a rogue unipolar power that is intervening with impunity around the world. 30,000, I think, is the last count of economic sanctions. 42 governments overturned. A long list of countries invaded and utterly destroyed. Physically destroyed, socially, politically destroyed. And what the world needs is real collective security that stands up to that rogue power and creates a world in which such a thing becomes impossible because there is genuine collective security. And that's what the G78 and the Canadian government needs to work towards.
All right. So, Manfred, we have a few minutes. I have a couple of questions to pose to you, but just to build on what you just said, what are there specific pieces of advice, instruments, countries, entities that the Canadian government should engage with in order to be part of this collective security initiative that you're talking about? And I really appreciate your point. I know that it was made in a critical context, but around diversifying the Canadian economy in terms of domestic industrial policy.
Mm-hmm.
That's something else, and that's something we have to work on very, very seriously and quickly. But what, do you have any specific advice? If you're sitting there with whoever is going to be tomorrow, the new foreign minister, maybe the same foreign minister, or you're sitting beside the prime minister, what do you tell them specifically? Do you have 5 or 6 things that they should do in addition to move in the direction you're in a way to move in the direction you're talking about?
Good. I honestly, I don't think it's a situation where I've indicated the directions we have to work towards. I've also noted that we are trapped. And for me now to glibly say, oh, the government should announce that it's going to join BRICS. At one level, I think BRICS actually represents an attempt at collective action, which, as far as I can tell, from the arrangements they are supporting, from the statements they are making, is intended to create an environment of mutual cooperation within a given set of rules. But I understand that given the terror threats, that it's not possible to glibly say, oh, well, Carney tomorrow should say we're joining BRICS, because I think we have to work diplomatically behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And we have to work towards bringing the Europeans to realize that Russia is not actually a threat to Europe. And the idea of spending 800 billion euros to build up a military, if anything, this will create a threat. I mean, this is exactly what that RAND document ultimately says, and what George Kennan said. If you keep pushing NATO, if you keep defining the other side as the enemy, then eventually they will end up arming. And China is arming because it's literally encircled by military bases in every possible direction. So we need to work, I believe, towards a world where the emphasis is on diplomacy rather than on military engagement. And the US has virtually abandoned diplomacy. I mean, the State Department has been all but dissolved, not quite as bad as USAID. So we are in a very difficult spot. But I think at this point, the only thing that can persuade the Americans is the realization that they don't actually have the capacity to coerce the rest of the world, because their limitations of their power are evident. They can't deal with Yemen at this point. They can't get Yemen to stop interdicting the shipping flow. In a panel just before shock and awe, just before the Iraq War, there was a panel at Carleton University, and I spoke at that panel. And I said, the neocons are fomenting this war because they think it will demonstrate to the world the overweening American military power. But what it will actually demonstrate to the world is that America has an almost unlimited capacity to destroy things and an almost unobservable capacity to build anything positive in its place. Look at Libya.
And also to radically overestimate its own influence and coherence.
And including its military influence. And that is coming.
On the specific issue of the United Nations, and perhaps also instruments around non-proliferation of nuclear weapons and mutually destruction, mutually assured destruction. Where do we go there? Because again, that's something that the Group of 78 is returning to. How do we get a reset there? Who do we work with on that?
Well, it's not easy, but I would certainly latch onto that one moment when Trump said he was in favor of nuclear control talks with Russia and China, and insofar as we could mobilize others at the UN to support that idea, I think that would be a very, very positive thing to try and do. Now, I realize Trump says one thing one day and the opposite the next day. So, but nevertheless, it's something to hold on to and to work with.
Good idea.
I think reality is actually also, I think Iran has shown that it effectively has a capacity to do enormous damage to Israel. In that exchange that is often misrepresented by many people, in that exchange, the Iranians actually showed that they could use drones to overwhelm the Iron Dome and to make space for the real missiles to reach their target. And the Russian military in Ukraine has shown that for the moment, it is superior to NATO because it's fighting NATO, it isn't fighting Ukraine. And the European noises that they will now stand up, they don't have the means to do that. And even if they embark on this insane militarization program, that will take 5 years until anything really serious is built up. And I hope that people can be persuaded long before then that this really is not necessary. If people sit down and talk about a world where security agreements are discussed and negotiated in good faith. But people have to stick to their treaties as well. The problem with the US recently is that they have simply, they have simply walked away from treaties in a totally unilateral manner.
They're not a reliable ally these days,
no, exactly. And so if you imagine yourself as Russia negotiating with the Americans, you couldn't. How could you rely on anything that was said?
Yeah. Listen, we're going to have to wrap up. This has been tremendous. You've given us a huge amount to think about and taken us, some of us, out of our comfort zone in ways that are important. Yeah. And it's really appreciated, the thoughtfulness and the rigor that you've brought to this. I think it's maybe you I don't know if you're already writing the book, but maybe you should be doing a book on this.
I'm not very good at that. I keep rewriting the same paragraph over and over again.
Well, you've got a lot underneath that paragraph, so maybe go to your notes.
Thank you very much, Bill.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. This has been tremendous, and stay tuned. We're going to have some other interesting things coming in the year ahead with the group of 78. And again, big thanks to Professor Bienefeld. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.